In chapter 3 of Parsons' book, there are a lot of similar principles covered as in the previous chapter related to political theory. There are some very similar underguiding principles that ideology and theory sort of rely on, and these are normative in nature, meaning that they have some kind of prescription for how politics should be run. So there are analytic elements, but they're drawing from a really sort of value-based system of measurement to begin with. The text definition of ideology is packages of conscious beliefs about how politics works and how normatively it should work. And more than that, it is also a guiding set of principles for your own political behavior. So your political action and decisions will be guided by your ideology. And we find out about trends in ideology across populations by looking at things like polling data, survey about political knowledge and public opinion, and this really gives us a wealth of information about how people form their ideologies and how those ideologies inform their political decisions. And this also plays into how our political culture is formed. Essentially, the culmination or the combination of everyone's political ideology sort of working against one another and with one another creates this sort of general culture surrounding politics and what types of behaviors we as a society find acceptable. And we pass that culture along through political socialization. And there's a lot of literature on political socialization that talks about the various agents of socialization. And they are many. If you look from education, your parents, religion, your workplace, so on and so on. There are really a lot of what we would call agents of socialization that help us understand how the political system works and give us kind of the framework for how we evaluate how politics is being conducted. The first ideology that's covered in your book is known as the liberal tradition, and this connects back to the philosophy that is presented by John Locke in the previous chapter. The focus of Locke was the rationality of human beings, the pursuit of private property and individual liberty, and an emphasis on sort of the importance of individuals' own decision-making power. Locke, as well as Adam Smith, focused on things like open markets and removal of government control of the economy, because prior to that, the economy had been controlled by religion, had been controlled by aristocratic elites. And so the liberalization of the economy really meant removing it from this kind of monopolistic control that these institutions once had. And the basis for a lot of these preferences within the liberal ideology, the classical liberal ideology, is that individuals are born equal and they are therefore endowed with certain rights by nature. And so that draws on Christian theology. Classical liberalism also focuses on representation. And a very important point that actually flows throughout all of these ideologies that we talk about is negative versus positive liberties. So the liberals were the first to sort of observe this, especially John Locke, that there are two types of liberties. There is one liberty that we know of as a negative liberty, and it's a little counterintuitive, but what that means is that in order for that liberty to be preserved, a negative action is required, meaning that the government must do nothing. And we interpret that to mean mean that the government should basically not govern over certain areas of individual lives. So for certain liberties to be observed in a negative sense, it just means that the government cannot impede that liberty. And in the case of a positive liberty, we really just mean that the government must make some action in order to ensure that that liberty is secured for individuals. Having talked about classical liberals, there is an important distinction to make between the classical liberal ideology and modern liberal ideology. The first major departure that modern liberalism takes from classical liberalism is a belief in positive and negative liberties. The classical liberal tradition held that the government really was there to protect private property and individual liberties. There was really no other role of the government, just to not impede those liberties. And modern liberals believe that the government has a role in leveling the playing field for some people and creating what we would term positive liberties. If we think about assistance programs and non-discrimination policies, and maybe even later in our history, some affirmative action policies, which are no longer really followed, these were more or less positive actions and liberties. So this does have mean that the liberal tradition sees a role of the welfare state, assistance programs for the poor, free education, a lot of things that we associate with liberalism today. Another branch which is more associated with today's modern conservatives, who we'll also talk about, is neoliberalism. And in essence, neoliberals, even though they share the core of their term with modern liberals, are very different. They believe that the government should actually remove itself from the economic concerns, much like the classical liberals did. So they're about individual liberties, but definitely about preserving the free market. And finally, just as a brief historical note, we talk about the left versus the right. As far as political ideologies are concerned, left are considered more liberal, right are considered more conservative. We'll clarify that later. But this actually goes back to the French Revolution, where the people who opposed the royals in sort of the post-revolution parliament had sat on the left, and those who supported them sat on the right. It's that simple. Moving on to conservatism and its variants, it's important to recognize that there are also some differences between classical conservatism and modern conservatism. The thing that they have in common is the general principle of conserving the status quo, conserving the power structures as they already exist, conserving authority as it already is. So the first principle of conservatism is one that classical liberals and modern conservatives actually agree on instead of disagree on. And that is the idea of economic freedom. So modern conservatives believed and classical liberals believed that the disadvantaged in life have as much opportunity as they need to succeed. And so it's an individual motive question over who is rich or poor. Moreover, people have incentives to compete and do well if they fear poverty and have incentives to pursue wealth. The government's job in all of this is merely to stay out of people's way. So the best approach by both of these ideologies is to cut taxes and to allow for individual entrepreneurship, which will overall sort of lift the economic opportunities for everyone. It's the idea behind the quote, "A rising tide lifts all boats." Moreover, dependency on welfare programs is bad for the economy, because if people are not motivated to work hard by the threat of poverty, frankly, then the economy won't be as robust as it could be. It won't be as productive as it could be. So again, these are the things that quite unexpectedly are in common between your classical liberal and modern conservatives. The second principle that we find actually agreement between both modern conservatives and classical conservatives is the principle of tradition, experience, and authority over radical change. This concept goes back to a philosopher known as Edmund Burke, who I incidentally wish had been covered in the previous chapter. But he has this quote of that the wisdom of the ages is far more capable of providing the guidance for society than any current contemporary whim. So he was very much in favor of aristocratic rule. He believed that authority and social traditions had been proven by time, and that essentially the maintaining of these structures, their importance to society was much more important, had far more weight than any individual injustices that might be incurred by that. So he believed that the French Revolution had gone too far in correcting the economic inequalities and the kind of decadent lifestyles that the royals were living. They were not corrected by the revolution at all. In fact, it led to excesses and eventually authoritarianism. So Burke wasn't completely wrong, but he did believe that it was the attempt to overthrow these traditions of the aristocratic royal rule that had been the downfall of the French. So Burke is one of those authors that believes that individuals are not necessarily created equal. There are inequalities between human beings, and the social structures rightfully represent that. And in that way, he really sort of echoes Aristotle's belief that, based on certain societies, certain types of arrangements might be absolutely accurate and fitting for that society. So conservatism is very interesting. There are some more divides that are coming up in the next video that we're going to talk about. But that concludes this discussion for now.